Thank you all for joining us today for the Symposium co-sponsored by the Australian National University and the Japan Research Institute, titled Searching for Productivity Growth in Australia and Japan. I am Kazuki Kitatsuji, economist at the Japan Research Institute, and I would like to serve as today's MC. You will find in your seats a paper that Ross Garnaut, one of our speakers, has prepared for us for today's symposium. The original version followed by tentative translation in Japanese, which was translated by the Australian National University. There is also a paper written by one of our economists, Mr. Shunpei Goto, about the Australian Productivity Commission. Unfortunately, this is written only in Japanese. We hope these materials will help in deepening your understanding of today's discussion. On behalf of the organizers, Mr. Katsunori Tanizaki, President and CEO of the Japan Research Institute, is delivering an opening address.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katsunori Tanizaki. I'm President and CEO of the Japan Research Institute Limited. Just on behalf of the organizers, I'd like to make a few remarks. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. I would also like to thank you once again for the exceptional understanding and support you have given to our activities. The Japan Research Institute, JRI, regularly holds symposiums on important policy and social issues of the day. Today's symposium is the first to be jointly hosted by the Australian National University, ANU, and our company, JRI. ANU, founded in 1946, is the Australia's only national university, ranked number 1 in Australia, and also one of the top universities in the world. The relationship between ANU and our company JRI just began in October last year, when we signed a MOU for cooperation and exchange in research and other relevant areas. We already had one of JRI's economists accepted as a visiting fellow at ANU. Through this symposium, we intend to further strengthen our relationship and actively disseminate information among the Australian and Japanese economies. The theme of the symposium is searching for productivity growth in Australia and Japan. After experience in a period of low growth, which some have called the lost 30 years, the Japanese economy is now just showing signs of emerging from past sluggish economies. The virtuous cycle between wages and prices is attracting attention as it will be the precondition for this trend to continue. A stable and consistent increase in productivity is essential for wages and rise to rise steadily. In this context, Australia enjoys extremely high labor productivity for a large country with a reasonably large population. This symposium will review Australia's efforts to increase productivity and deepen the discussion on what measures should we take to boost productivity growth in both Japan and Australia. Today, we have invited Mr. Masaaki Shirakawa as the keynote speaker. He served as the governor of the Bank of Japan from 2008 to 2013 and is currently a distinguished guest professor at Aoyama Gakuin University. We also have invited several experts as panelists. Mr. Ross Garnaut, Professor Emeritus of the University of Melbourne, is an expert in economic policy and international relations. He has served in numerous high-level government positions, including Principal Economic Advisor to Australian Prime Minister Bob Hawke and Australian Ambassador to China. Mr. Michael Brennan is an economic policy professional who held several senior government positions, including Deputy Secretary of the Federal Treasury's Party Fiscal Group and Chair of the Australian Productivity Commission, and is currently CEO of the Non-Partisan Economic Research Institute, E61. Mr. Shiro Armstrong, Professor at the Crawford School of Government, Australian National University, and is also Director of the Australian-Japan Research Centre there. He specializes in international trade and international economic policy. Mr. Kyoji Fukao is Chairman of the Research Institute of Economy, Trade and Industry, and Professor at the Institute of Economic Research for Hitotsubashi University. He is one of Japan's leading economists in the area of productivity and international economics. And our chair, Yuri Okina, will also participate as a panelist. She has recently been elected chairperson of the Government Tax Commission. The panel discussion will be moderated by Mr. Ippei Fujiwara. He is professor of both Keio University and NU. I would be more than happy if today's discussion will not only contribute to the advancement of productivity in Australia and our country, Japan, but also provide useful hints to all of you here working in business and as a person managing a company myself, I would also like to take action from what I will learn from today's discussion. I would like to thank once again the experts who will be discussing this issue and all of you participating here. And I wish for a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much for your time today. Thank you.
We will now proceed to the keynote speech. It is our great honor to introduce our speaker, Mr. Masaaki Shirakawa, distinguished guest professor at Aoyama Gakuin University and former governor of the Bank of Japan. Mr. Shirakawa, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this conference jointly held by the Australian National University and the Japan Research Institute. I was invited to the conference organized by Australian National University 2 times in the past. Every time I attended, I enjoyed the discussion and I learned a lot. And I expect the same thing will happen to me, so I'm very excited about being here. The title of today's conference, Searching for Productive Growth in Australia and Japan, is quite timely and relevant, considering that the trend growth rate has been declining in both countries. Why do we discuss productivity? Paul Krugman once said, productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it is almost everything. A country's ability to improve the standard of living over time depends almost entirely on its ability to raise its output per workers. I agree with him. But having said that, in discussing living standard, just focusing on productivity is sometimes misleading or too narrow. If I'm allowed 2 more words in capturing the challenge facing both countries in terms of living standard, one is demographics. Although the average population growth rate of Australia is higher, and nature of demographic challenge is a bit different. When I say the importance of demographics, I do not mean demographics and productivity are independent. Rather, they are inherently related, as I will discuss later. The other important word is societal choice. Demographics and productivity are ultimately reflecting the societal choice of what kind of society we want to have in a fundamental sense. So I have decided to fulfill my duty as a keynote speaker by speaking under the title Productivity, Demographics, and Societal Choice. I will start with discussing demographics. Demographic challenges facing Japan is literally unprecedented in modern economic history in the world. Its working age population peaked at 1995. The cumulative decline in 3 decades from the peak to 2023 is 13.3 million, or 15.3%. Annualized decline rate is 0.6%. No country has ever lost working age population on this scale for reasons not related to war or illness. Total population in Japan peaked in 2010. Its cumulative decline to the present is 2.8%, and annual decline rate is 0.2%. Looking into the future, total population decline is expected to be accelerated. According to the median estimate of the latest long-run projection by National Institute of Population on Social Security Research, it is projected to decline from the peak of 128 million to 105 million by 2050 and 87 million by 2070. This is really a scaring projection. Probably the best way to explain about significant impact of demographic change is to make an international comparison of growth rate of G7 countries. By the way, this is one of my favorite charts. The slide shows growth rate of GDP between 2000 and 2015. Yes, Japan's growth rate, as is shown in the right-hand side, is lowest among G7 countries. But at the same time, Japan's growth rate in terms of GDP per working age population, as is shown in the left-hand side, is the highest. Japan's growth rate per person, which is not depicted in this chart, is just average of G7 countries. By saying this, I do not mean GDP growth is unimportant. Of course, GDP growth is quite important and relevant in considering issues such as the international presence of a country in the field of foreign policy and defense, or sustainability of government finances and social security program. On the other hand, it is the growth of GDP per person rather than growth of GDP itself that matters for living standards of individual citizens. For this reason, some Japanese are arguing that declining population is not a bad thing. I disagree with this argument. Their argument is based on the implicit understanding that GDP per person or labor productivity is not affected by declining population. But actually, this is not the case. Looking at the Japanese experiences, at least there seems to exist 4 kinds of mechanisms that declining population affects productivity growth adversely. First, aging, which is an inevitable result of declining population due to low birth rate, affects productivity growth and productivity growth through voters' preference. median age of Japanese population is steadily increasing. As of 2022, it was 48.7 years old. The political consequences of aging is less government spending on basic research and higher education, and more government spending on social welfare program, which tends to lead to less productivity growth. This is a problem of so-called gray-hair democracy. Second, aging affects societal choice, speed of embracing new technology. The economy-wide productivity growth depends importantly on societal ability to embrace new technology. New technology itself could be potential raise productivity, but generally speaking, the elderly are slow to adapt to changing technology. That is perfectly applies to me. Third, declining population tends to lower the economy-wide productive growth by delaying the necessary reallocation of resources across regions. As you can see, municipalities with increasing population are confined to only a few areas, such as metropolitan Tokyo. In population declining municipalities, it becomes costly to maintain the same level of public infrastructure, such as roads, hospitals, elementary schools, once the size of population falls between a certain threshold level. The same is true for many types of private sector services. Market size of location is one of the crucial factors affecting productivity, especially in service sector. Productivity-wise, smooth resource allocation across region or city or town is a key. But such reallocation of resources is very difficult in population decreasing society. Its result is gradual decline in productivity growth. Fourth, declining population might decrease growth rate by reducing the number of potential talent pool of innovators. A smaller number of innovators can make outsized contribution to productivity and growth. If the likelihood that such innovators appears is constant in relation to total population size, then the absolute number of innovators will decline as population declines. When it comes to productivity, we tend to spend too much time on talking about AI or robotics or need for innovation. But such technocratic approach is not enough. Of course, once we recognize such complex political and social dynamics leading to declining productive growth, we have to think deeply of how to boost productivity. The same is true for how to increase workforce, as I will talk later. I will start with discussing productivity. Is it possible for Japan to boost productive growth materially? Earlier, I referred to the fact that Japan's growth of GDP per working age population is already the highest among G7 countries. Given this already good performance, it is natural to think it is hard to further increase productivity growth. But if we look at the level of productivity rather than its growth, there seems to be much room for improvement potentially. According to research by Japanese think tank based on OECD data, Japan is ranked as 31st among OECD countries. For your reference, Australia is ranked as 11th. The level of Japanese productivity is 64% as much as that of Australia, according to this study. Of course, the measurement of productivity is daunting science, so I'm not talking about precise number, but the main message is Japan's level of productivity is low. To the extent the level of productivity is low, there seems to be a greater potential for productivity catch-up. But this assessment needs some caution. This kind of an international comparison presupposes the existence of the same products, but actually products offered are not necessarily the same across countries. A case in point is the service of Shinkansen. Japan's bullet train departs every 3 minutes and 20 seconds, but average delay time is very short. For example, it was 12 seconds in 2022. This is amazing punctuality. As far as I know, such services are rather rare in foreign countries. To say Japan's productivity is low means that hypothetical provider of such services in foreign countries is more efficient than Japanese provider. I'm doubtful about this. If we make an apple-to-apple comparison about productivity, probably Japan's productivity level will not be that low. This is just one example. The Japanese society, and for that matter, the Japanese companies, emphasizes various non-economic values such as absolute accuracy, absolute safety, and absolute stability or absolute cleanness, etc. As above example shows, boosting productivity is not necessarily about technology, but about societal choice, namely what kind of society we want to have. There are so many cases where societal choice matters in terms of productivity. Earlier, I explained declining population tend to lower productivity growth by delaying resource allocation across regions. Japan's long-term employment practice, which used to be effective in Japan's high-growth period, is another example. It now tends to lower productive growth by inhibiting smooth labor reallocation. I'm not saying the Japanese way is good or bad. The point is we have to reflect on what is most important in increasing social welfare as opposed to productivity. Productivity, or at least conventionally measured productivity, is not everything. This slide shows one bold attempt to measure social welfare depicted by red bar as opposed to GDP depicted by blue bar. Left-hand side is a level and the right-hand side is growth. Three elements are explicitly considered in measuring welfare: work hours, life expectancy, and equality of income distribution. Compared with other major economies, Japan's growth performance is among Japan's growth performance of welfare is among the best. Japan's work hours are still long in an international comparison, but we made deliberate effort in reducing it the past 3 decades. Life expectancy is the second longest next to Hong Kong. Income inequality in Japan has widened, but less so in an international comparison, especially compared with the US. What we have to think is how we should strike a balance between productivity and other factors affecting living standard or social welfare. Now I will move on to the issue of how to boost workforce and prevent declining birth rate. The most significant way to increase workers is to boost labor participation rate. In this respect, Japan's labor participation rate for the elderly is already the highest among advanced economies. But further room for increasing labor participation rate for the elderly is non-existent. In terms of gender, it was well known that Japan's labor participation rate for female had been low, but in recent decades, it has increased tremendously. It is now higher in Japan than in the US, though still lower than in Nordic countries. The problem with Japan's female participation rate is the number of female workers taking on management position is few. We have to redouble our effort. Receiving more foreign workers or immigrants is the second way to increase workers. The ratio of foreign-born people to total population is still as low as 2%. But if we look at flow number, the situation is now rapidly changing. According to OECD statistics, among OECD countries, prior to the COVID-19 crisis, Japan was already the fourth largest country in terms of annual inflow of foreign workers. According to the aforementioned research by the Institute, average annual increase in foreign workers in the period between 2022 and 2070 is projected to be 164,000 persons. This number is already not insignificant compared with the number of newborn Japanese babies of about 770,000. Annualized increase in foreign workers already amount to about 1/5 of Japanese babies. If this trend continues, as a baseline case shown in the right-hand side, the ratio of foreign workers to total population will increase to 10.8% in 2070, and that of people aged between 18 years old and 30 years old will increase to 16.8%. The third way to increase workers is an effort at boosting birth rate. Given the Japanese situation that extramarital child is very rare, action needed is to increase marriage itself and the number of babies for married couples. As for the former, it is striking that marriage rate for non-regular workers is so low. In this respect, various social policy and income distribution policy are needed. As for the latter, we are not sure what is effective in boosting birth rate for couples, but attempting to boost birth rate is still important. In recent years, government is giving couples various financial incentives, such as subsidy to fee for kindergarten and school tuition. But we have to note that significant part of cost of raising children is the foregone income of female due to termination of career. In this respect, it is striking that the ratio of female taking a temporary job sharply increased after they give birth. Considering this, what seems to be most important than financial incentive in boosting birth rate is to change social practice of Japanese society in terms of raising children. A case in point is paternal leave. It is not so common for the Japanese husband to take a long paternal leave. When it comes to low birth rate, as is clear from my explanation, we need not only economic analysis, but also sociological analysis. Finally, I will offer my assessment of how successful Japan will be in terms of productivity in decades to come. In this respect, the past might be some guide. The performance was not so bad as is implied by oft-used expression lost decade. If we adjust for a decline in population, but not so good compared with high bar necessitated by rapid decline in population. I would say this underperformance is related to the fact that the cause of low growth was wrongly identified. Judging from public discourse in the past, what was mainly identified as a cause was almost always deflation. Overcoming deflation was used almost like a mantra in many official statements of government, remarks by CEO of companies, and economists' commentary. How about future prospects? There are some positive developments. First, compared with a few years ago, people are increasingly aware of the importance of tackling with demographic challenges, though somewhat belatedly. The second, recent labor shortage due to withdrawal of baby boomer generation, who is now mid-70 years old, is making inefficient firms exit from the market. Of course, this is a painful process, but nonetheless, it has the effect of raising productivity. Third, on monetary policy front, baby step measures was taken recently. In retrospect, prolonged period of ultra-accommodative monetary policy had the effect of keeping inefficient firms alive, which tended to lower productive growth. At this moment, we do not know to what extent the situation will change in the future, but at least it is heading for good direction. At the same time, there are some concerning phenomena as well. A case in point is oft heard expression of virtuous cycle between wage and prices. Nowadays, wage increase is increasingly discussed as if it is a critical condition or magic for revival of the Japanese economy. But just tinkering with nominal wage is nothing to do with economic fundamentals. Stating the obvious, what does matter is productivity. So far, I have not mentioned about Australia explicitly. Recently, I read the report by Business Council of Australia titled Seize the Moment. The report said, "We are homes to a rich array of talented and educated people, yet we are languishing when it comes to productivity and global competitiveness." For me, this report seems to be too critical about the current situation in Australia in terms of productivity. But my second thought is what I said today about Japanese productivity might be too critical viewed from Australian participants in this room. The grass may be always greener on the other side. For me, Australia has many enviable strengths. For example, you have favorable demographics, which includes your ability to receive talented people, which could be a very source of innovation. In terms of economic policy, I envy Australia of having Productivity Commission as an agency of Australian government. Japan does not have a counterpart institution in government. in any event, since each country is different with its own heritage and social contracts. It has to think of how it can raise productivity, and for that matter, what kind of society we want to have. In this respect, I believe both Japanese and Australian participants will be able to learn many things in this conference. Thank you for your kind attention.
Mr. Shirakawa, thank you very much. Now, I would like to move on to the panel discussion. Panelists, please come up to the stage. Please let me introduce the panelists. Mr. Shiro Armstrong, Professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy, Australian National University. Mr. Ross Garnaut, Professor Emeritus at the University of Melbourne. Mr. Michael Brennan, CEO of E61 Institute and former chair of the Productivity Commission. Mr. Kyoji Fukao, Chairman of the Research Institute of Economy, Trade and Industry, and Special Appointed Professor at Hitotsubashi University. Ms. Yuri Okina, Chairperson of the Japan Research Institute. Our moderator for today's panel discussion is Mr. Ippei Fujiwara, Professor at Faculty of Economics, Keio University, and Crawford School of Public Policy, Australian National University.
Okay, so let's start the panel session. We are really fortunate to have such a fantastic, excellent, amazing panelists that we could not have asked for anymore to discuss the productivity issues in Australia and Japan. And before, because time is limited, we have a fantastic number of the panelists, but we only have 2 hours. So I would like to start immediately. But before starting the presentation, let me talk about the flow of the presentation. So first, we're going to start with the Australian session, started by the presentation by Ross, and then followed by the Michael. Then we're going to have a brief discussion among the panelists. Then we ask the Shiro Armstrong to discuss the overarching issues between Australia and Japan and the global issues. Then we will move on to the Japan session, and presented by Kyoji Fukao. Oh, Kyoji, by the way, I heard today is your birthday. Okay. Yeah. I won't sing because I'm a terrible singer, but happy birthday. So thanks for coming to the panel discussion on your birthday. Then followed by the presentation by Yuri Okina. Then again, we're going to have a panel discussion among the panelists. Then we're going to have a discussion among the panelists and floor participants. We eagerly anticipate active discussions among all of us. So without further ado, so Ross, could you start your presentation? Please join me in welcoming Ross for the presenter.
Thank you, Ippei. It's a great pleasure to be here talking on this matter, very timely matter for both of our countries. And thank you, Professor Shirakawa, for that stimulating introduction. That chart that shows that output per working age person has grown more rapidly in Japan for a considerable time is quite a startling chart. I must say that I think that Australians are a little bit complacent, and I think that the rather pessimistic or negative view put by the Business Council is warranted, especially in comparison with Japan. We think of ourselves as doing fairly well because we've only had one recession since 1991. That was during the pandemic. But we would have had several if our given our per capita growth rate, if our population had grown at the negative rate of Japan. Since 2013, output per person has grown more slowly in Australia than Japan, and Professor Shirakawa has put another angle on that by showing that output per working person has grown even better in Japan compared with Australia. So something for Australians to think about. In Australia, if we go back to the foundations of our modern economy, and I think it's useful to go back to 1957, the trade agreement between Australia and Japan. That was time when two people very well known to the old people in this audience, John Crawford at ANU and counterparts in Japan, put together what was at the time a rather radical step, a free trade agreement that where Australia, just 12 years after the war, gave most favoured nation treatment, removed all discrimination in trade against Japan, and Japan reduced protection on a number of goods that were highly protected but important to Australia, most importantly wool. And one feature of that was that it was big trade liberalisation on both sides without any discrimination against outsiders. It was non-discriminatory, consistent with Article 4 of what was then a young GATT, a young General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. That was very important to the development of both of our countries in the subsequent period. In the 1960s, we had the extraordinary doubling, first of all, plan to double output in a decade in Japan, but achieved in only 7 years, Saburo Okita's income doubling plan. And in Australia, we had a period of accelerated growth at the beginning of a big structural change in our economy, the restructuring of the economy, with mining very important to provide industrial raw materials for the rapid Japanese growth. Foundationally important, very strong productivity growth, output growth in both countries, and it could not have happened without each of our countries. Japan's industrialization at that time was really the first time a big country had undertaken rapid industrial growth entirely on the basis of commercial relations, very large-scale imports of raw materials, without a framework of the old empires that were dismantled after the war. That opening of Australia and Japan was especially important because our two economies are unusual economies on a world scale. We've got very skewed relative resource endowments. Japan may be the weakest in terms of natural resources per person, or maybe South Korea similar to Japan, but very low per capita endowments. Australia very high per capita endowments, and both of us need high levels of foreign trade to attain prosperity. We need an open international trading system. We need to be able to trade with each other very freely, but we need both of us to be able to trade freely with the world. And really that was reflected in that 1957 agreement. And a couple of later times after 57, understandings between Australia and Japan were very important to growth in both of our countries. We both got big shocks in the 1970s. So oil had been abundant and cheap, and Japanese industrialization had been built around that in the 60s and early 70s. And you had the oil price shock, the big lift in the price of petroleum relative to other things. That was also was disruptive right through the developed world, including in Australia, but especially challenging for Japan, which had built its economy around imported petroleum. And that close relationship of trust that had been built in the raw materials trade formed the foundation of a big restructuring of trade for both of us in the 70s. Japan moved away from reliance on petroleum, and which mainly came from the Middle East, with all of its insecurity. Japan was able to rely on reliable and secure sources of trade in energy from Australia in the form of coal and gas and uranium, and with the result that when that restructuring was finished, it was completed, today, more than twice as much energy comes from Australia for Japan as from Saudi Arabia, the second biggest economy. And of course, that restructuring also supported growth of new industries in Australia. Now, we're facing another time of challenge right at the moment, where we're going to have to go through another big restructuring, and the trust between our people, the strong relationship we've had, the understandings, is going to be even more important in this next period than it was in those earlier periods where it underpinned growth for both of us. This is a time of great disruption. Since the global financial crisis, we've had disruption of the international economy, of international finance and trade, and it hasn't got better. In fact, the disruption of open trade and multilateral trade is probably now at its greatest height. It was exacerbated, of course, by the Trump presidency, but the movement away from open multilateral trade in the United States was not reversed when the president changed. There's an awful continuity in trade policy and macroeconomic policy between Presidents Trump and Biden. Of course, the pandemic was a very big disruption of international economics. The geostrategic tension with China is a very big disruption of international trade. The fact that there is that tension with China and difficulties in open trade with China doesn't diminish the fact that Japan and Australia just still need open trade as much as ever for our prosperity. So the challenge has increased. And on top of all of that, we now both have to go through radical restructuring of our economy to adjust to the challenge of climate change. It's a fundamental challenge. Both Japan and Australia have agreed with each other and with every country on Earth through the United Nations to try to hold temperature increases caused by human activity to 1.5 degrees. That means we must get to net zero by 2050. We've promised that to each other. We've promised it to every other country on Earth. It's a very solemn commitment. It's crucial that we get there, or we will destabilize the international order upon which all of our prosperity depends. But it's going to be a very big challenge of structural change in both of our economies. Australia developed huge coal and gas industries, at first on the back of the requirements of the Japanese economy after the oil shocks of the early 70s, but then to support the growth of Korea and later the growth of China. Huge industries, our second and third biggest export industries. And if we all meet our solemn commitments to each other and the international community, we will have almost no coal and gas industries at the middle of the century, just a quarter of a century away, or else we will have undertaken big investments to deal with the emissions, which will be expensive and difficult. So Australia has to go through a big adjustment, and of course Japan does too. And Japan's lack of natural resources could be corrected through foreign trade in the way that we did after 1957 through the 60s, the 70s, very large imports of energy as well as industrial raw materials and metallic minerals. Well, the metallic minerals doesn't change so much, but it is harder for Japan to deal with its deficiencies in energy in the zero carbon economy than in the high carbon economy, because it's much more expensive to move renewable energy by submarine cable or through derivatives like hydrogen or ammonia, much more expensive and difficult than to move coal or petroleum. So a very big challenge. And the answer this time is going to have much in common with the answers on those earlier occasions. And the answer for Japan and Australia is going to have a very big component of close cooperation, using those relationships of trust and understanding that we've built up over 67 years in a new area, because the way for Japan to get secure, reliable sources of renewable energy, the biggest way to do it cheaply and securely will be to import goods embodying renewable energy from Australia: green iron, green aluminium, green silicon, green transport fuels, so that you don't have to use renewable energy you do not have to do that in Japan. To make this work, we'll have to look at many different things. We have to understand some basic economics. Basic economics says that when one firm is doing great damage to another by imposing external costs on others, this case the external cost of carbon emissions, then that needs to be taxed. So markets will not work unless external costs are taxed. And that was understood even by the most fundamentalist of market fundamentalists, Friedman and von Hayek. They recognized that for markets to work, you have to tax external economies in the environment. And the other big externality that has to be corrected is that innovation is a positive externality. The firm that does the innovating creates benefits for many others. It creates knowledge. It proves what can be done right and also proves what can be done wrong. The innovator makes a lot of mistakes. It imposes a lot of costs on itself and teaches others what to do. And so we will not get change, innovation fast enough unless the external benefits of innovation are corrected. We have to understand these basic things as we go forward. We will do much better if we understand them together and communicate a lot so that we each understand how the other is thinking about these things. In my discussions here the last couple of days in Japan, I've been very pleased to see the recognition of these two externalities that have to be corrected. In Australia, we sometimes recognize those things, sometimes not. But together we have to understand these economic realities and find ways together and cooperatively to implement them. I think that some of the institutions that we used in the past, things like that, are applicable now for the big transition to a zero-carbon economy we have to make. I remember in the 70s the work that was done, the joint studies led by Sir John Crawford at ANU and Saburo Okita at the Nihon Keizai Kenkyu Center, that feeding up to senior officials who were coordinating new policy. I think that type of work and understanding can play a big role in this big new transformation that we have to make. Make this transformation cooperatively, use opportunities for international trade, deepening our own relationship, doing it in a way like we did before that does not discriminate against other countries, and we'll find that we still have a basis for productivity growth, rising incomes, while dealing with the problems of climate that we have to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ross, for offering the very comprehensive view and putting the emphasis on the importance of the cooperation and for the externality about the environmental issues and the innovation. Thank you so much. Then we're going to have a presentation by Michael. Could you start?
Firstly, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for having me. I wanted to talk about three things briefly. One, a specific aspect of the productivity debate that I think is under-discussed in Australia and possibly in Japan, and that is the shift to services and the rise of the share of employment in the non-tradables sector in particular. And I want to flesh out a bit of a hypothesis based on firm-level microdata, which is a fairly new development in Australia, to demonstrate that issue about the shift to services and the challenge that it may pose for productivity growth. And then finally, I'll just shift gear and talk a little bit about an aspect of the Australian policy architecture to which Shirakawa-san referred, which is the fact that we have a Productivity Commission, and I'll explain a little bit about how the Productivity Commission operates in Australia within our system of government. As a starting point, when the IMF put out the World Economic Outlook just recently, it noted that the 5-year forward forecast for real GDP growth was, in 2000, that 5-year forward-looking forecast was for average growth in world GDP of 4.4%. Today, that 5-year forward-looking forecast is just 2.8%. So there's a palpable sense in which the medium-term growth prospects for the globe have come down. And within that, the biggest single factor is the fall in total factor productivity. So total factor productivity averaged 1.3% growth per annum in the period of the late 1990s, but only 0.2% in the period since the global financial crisis. Roughly half of the fall in projected real GDP growth is represented by the projected fall in TFP growth. Now, that is partly, no doubt, a function of the pace of technological advance, but the IMF points to a different problem, and that is what it perceives as a rising misallocation of labour and capital across firms in economies, across developed and emerging and developing economies. That is a widening disparity within sectors between the most and the least productive firms, and where we might expect to see labour and capital flowing from the less productive firms to the more productive firms at the frontier. But that process is both slow and incomplete. And I'm going to come to 2 examples of that in the Australian context. One of the really important findings by the IMF was that total factor productivity loss, the resource misallocation effect, is higher in the services sector than it is in the goods sector. Now, my starting point here, and the first point I want to make about productivity growth in Australia, is that it has slowed. As you can see from the chart here, the darker green bars reflecting productivity growth, a materially lower level of productivity growth in the 2000s and the decade since 2010. Household income growth has also now slowed to match. Shirakawa-san quoted Paul Krugman's famous admonition that productivity growth in the long run is almost everything. It's important to recognise that in Australia, in the short term, it's not almost everything. There is another big thing, which is the export prices for commodities like iron ore and coal and LNG, which have an outsized effect on household income growth. They have a temporary effect, often a boost to nominal GDP, but they have real effects both on income levels and resource allocation within the economy. Underscoring that, looking at this chart, you note the point that Ross just made about the remarkable skewness of the Australian economy. The share of resource exports, around 60%, or a bit over 60% of Australian exports from the resources sector. It may surprise you to know that the share of employment in the resources sector in Australia is 2%. So 2% of employment, over 60% of exports by value. And a similarly, a slightly larger share of GDP. The key point in Australia, and this is an issue about the way the resources, and the English expression that the tail wags the dog, the resources tail sort of wags the economy-wide dog. Australia's economy, like most developed economies, is a services-dominated economy. 80% of GDP is represented by services industries and 90% of employment. Now, some of the services sector is export-focused, but for the most part, it's in non-tradable sectors. And as the chart on the left illustrates, productivity growth in the services sector has lagged that in the goods sector. And that, in a way, is the medium-term version of the inflation dilemma that our central bank and other central banks now confront, that services inflation, non-tradables inflation is sticky, and that's largely because of the labour content. These services are fairly labour-intensive. They have a lower productivity level, but they've also had lower productivity growth. They're relatively hard to automate. They're hard to mass produce, in part because services are, to some extent, bespoke, unique experiences, co-created, if you like, between the service provider and the consumer. But the question that the IMF effectively raises is, could there, in addition to these issues that there is less capital intensity, difficulty in automating, could it be that the services sector has greater adjustment frictions, and that could be a part of this resource misallocation story that we're seeing now potentially play out? The question as to why the services sector grows over time is an interesting one. There are three main reasons in the Australian context why this might be the case. One is the cost disease phenomenon popularised by William Baumol in the 1960s, where, as per this chart on the left, if you have relatively rapid productivity growth in some sectors and slow productivity growth in others, depending on the elasticity of substitution in consumption, under plausible assumptions, it's the low productivity growth sectors that tend to grow as a share of the economy. And there may be something of that underpinning the rise in services, though that is largely a closed economy case. There is also the Dutch disease issue. When you have a significant rise in commodity prices, as Australia has had, that has a real income effect, but it also has an effect on the real exchange rate. And there is a tendency then for resources to flow away from other tradable sectors into both the commodity exporting sector, but also into the non-tradable sector. And that could be a part of this. And there is just the fact that with income growth, demand for services tends to rise as a share of the overall consumer bundle. Government is one channel by which this occurs. And in Australia, we have seen increasing service delivery funded by government using very labour-intensive models, and often models that lock in particular levels of labour through staff ratios and this sort of thing. This is in areas like disability services, aged care, childcare, health and education. The employment in these services in the non-market sector in Australia has risen from around the low 20% of the overall workforce in the early 2000s to nearly 30% today. And in many ways, this is part of the full employment story in Australia, that we've had these capital-intensive export industries raising additional revenue and price effects there, raising income, including raising tax revenue to government, much of which has then been spent on relatively labour-intensive services in the Australian economy. Now, that is good for underpinning full employment. It's not a bad model. It reflects a degree of consumer preference, but it's not necessarily a great recipe for ongoing productivity growth. And from a fiscal point of view, it kind of represents governments raising revenue in the nominal economy and spending it in the real economy, and now coming up against the supply side constraints that we're seeing as a result of inflation, or we're seeing inflation as the manifestation of this. So just to the two vital signs that I wanted to briefly discuss that demonstrate a particular channel by which a large services sector could be potentially a bit of a brake on productivity growth. The first one deals with labour mobility, and it's an established fact in the Australian economy. Labour mobility has slowed, so the rate of job switching by employees has slowed. But it's also that when labour moves, it is less clear today that it is consistently moving from less productive uses to more productive uses. So this chart on the left measures the difference in the average productivity. This is for all job transitions across the Australian economy using microdata. The difference in the average productivity between the origin firm and the destination firm. And the key point is it's diminishing over time. So that gap the uplift in productivity when a worker changes firms is diminishing. And you see from the chart on the right that this is a particularly important thing for young workers in particular. Young workers tend to have a very high differential. They move around more and they have a higher differential between the origin and the destination firm. And it has been associated also with pay rises. Young people, this is a vehicle by which young workers see their earnings rise, particularly early in their career, moving from less to more productive firms. But that diffusion mechanism, if you like, that reallocative mechanism appears to have slowed. And the second I thought I'd raise is immigration, because I know it is of interest to Japan. You know that immigration is a big story in Australia, as that chart on the left demonstrates. And to Shirakawa-san's point that we have both natural increase, but we also have productivity growth, immigration contributing to overall population growth fairly substantially. But what this chart on the right demonstrates is that the distribution of migrant workers across firms by productivity quintile is actually worse, if you like, or more misallocated than the non-migrant labour. And this should come as something of a surprise, because we might expect migrants to be the marginal worker and therefore disproportionately heading towards firms that are in the top productivity quintile. It does not appear to be the case. And in fact, over recent years, as the chart on the left shows, the proportion of migrants going into firms in the top quintile of productivity have fallen, and more migrants are going into these firms in the second and third productivity quintile. It does depend a little on the visa category. The temporary skilled category has the best distribution, the permanent skilled a little less so, and the students and working holiday makers are the least well distributed. But it's an interesting point because it does say something about policy. We have a very substantial immigration intake. It does have many positive benefits, but it's not clear that we're maximising the benefit for productivity. It might be because we've allowed it to become a little bit of a tool of rent seeking by business, just to fill some labour or some skills gaps as they see it, or some labour gaps, rather than being really discerning both about which migrants we bring in, but also where they might be headed, which employers, particularly for the temporary skilled category. I should just mention too that for this exercise, the students and the working holiday makers, they tend to go into lower productivity industries, but we're applying industry fixed effects here. So this is actually, they're going to low productivity firms within each industry. It's a within sector effect. So these are all signs that the economy in some ways is becoming a little less effective at allocating resources to the highest value use. It could be a function of explicit frictions that limit the mobility of capital and labour, but it could also be a lack of competition. I did note in Shiro's latest report about inbound foreign investment, or outbound Japanese foreign investment into Australia. One of the attractions of Australia was, if you like, the lack of competition, almost, the relative stability, the high markups that might be on offer. Good for the investor, maybe not so good for the competitive spirit in the Australian economy. So hence the IMF finding that there might be greater challenge in services. One of the things about the service sector is that the price signals can be a little bit opaque. It's hard to adjust for quality. That's both for statistical measurement, but it's true for the consumer as well. It's hard for consumers often to measure the quality. It's hard for consumers to convey the quality more broadly to other consumers because the service is so unique and bespoke. Services are often highly regulated, and of course, as I mentioned, they are often government funded and government delivered with limited price signals. And so market share, which operates in other sectors quite effectively to allocate resources to the highest value use and the use of the price system, might be just a little bit less applicable in the services sector across the board. So whereas our conceptual model for thinking about competition often starts at least with the perfect competition ideal as the starting point, in many ways in services, I think monopolistic competition is kind of the natural starting point for us. So I just pause on this. This is a dimension of the productivity challenge in Australia that I think goes a little unremarked all of our economies now are dominated by services. They're a growing share of employment, a growing share of, and employment in non-tradables is a growing share. I suspect even in Japan, it's natural to see the productivity challenge in terms of the competitiveness of the export-focused traditional industry sectors, and that obviously is fundamental. But it's also clear that the dynamism, the competitive forces within the domestic economy are also going to be very, very important to productivity growth going forward. They're certainly increasingly important for Australia. And so finally, just to sum up, and a quick shift of gear, just to mention the role of the Productivity Commission in Australia, and this could start a bit of conversation later in the discussion. There is always a role, I think, in policy for frontier research. The institute of which I'm now a part, E61, conducts that sort of academic quality frontier research. So it's important, I think, to have institutes that are independent, doing academic quality work, like Rieti, for example. But the Productivity Commission in Australia is a slightly different model to that. It really brings together two key attributes. One is that it is independent of the government of the day. So it's established under a separate act with a high degree of freedom to speak freely, to come up with conclusions which are not dictated by the government. But the second is that it's not really about cutting-edge academic research. It is really populated by policy people. It is essentially policy people given a degree of independence to sit outside the day-to-day operations of government and to provide frank and fearless advice back towards government. So rather than, say, starting with a research question or a hypothesis to test in the way that an academic might, the Productivity Commission is given a policy problem and told to go away and think about it from first principles. And the key things are, it's an independent process, it's a transparent process, one that involves putting out issues papers, draft reports, taking submissions, all of which are on the public record, and conducting public hearings. And finally, and crucially, taking the economy-wide view, so not being beholden to a particular industry view, not being beholden to the view of a particular part of government. So it's not perfect, and Ross is absolutely right. We shouldn't be too sort of sunny about the prospects in Australia. We have a lot of policy challenges, but the Productivity Commission, as one piece of architecture, may be something that warrants a bit of consideration. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, sir. What an insightful presentation, touching on issues such as a structural transformation towards more like a service economy and the labor mobility, and also like a migration through the lens of the misallocation, which is the kind of the hot issues in the macroeconomics as of now. And they are all relevant to Japan. And also you mentioned about the institutional setting of the Productivity Commission. That's also very informative. So now I'd like to have some discussion among the panelists, but just I found Yuri, so maybe so could you maybe start some discussion?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the very insightful presentations. I would like to comment from the viewpoint of Japan's challenges. It is evident that Japan's manufacturing competitiveness, which has relied on importing fossil fuels from Australia and other countries, faces challenges as we move towards a zero-emission future. It is also true that Japan traditionally had a comparative advantage in the auto industry due to its expertise in fine-tuning technology. However, it's uncertain how sustainable this advantage can be maintained in the long run amid environmental shifts such as the trend toward electric vehicles and the expansion of use of AI. Nevertheless, Japanese companies have a history of overcoming energy crisis through innovation for many times. So we have to struggle with this change, big change, to switch the business model to the new zero carbon emissions future. And looking ahead, I believe that Japan and Australia can build a complementary relationship even in a zero emissions world. Japan must explore a future vision for its industry to maintain its comparative advantage. I also agree with you that in-depth discussions involving both governments and private sectors will be essential in the future. How to structure the division of roles between Australia and Japan. And I'd like to comment Michael's presentation about migration policy, because we are just starting to invite foreign workers these 3 years. And I think your charts offers valuable insights and derived from data analysis. Particularly noteworthy is the observation that immigrants in Australia are increasingly employed in firms with low productivity. Why the cause, whether it stems from immigrants' skill levels or inefficiency in job matching, remains just a bit unclear. But this analysis is pertinent for Japan's future consideration of expanding its acceptance of foreign labor. Japan is currently in the early stages of such analysis. And although Japan had around 2 million people, foreign workers, as of last October, it was until 2019 that the country formally began actively inviting foreign laborers. The introduction of the specific skills workers visa system allowed for the acceptance of foreign workers with specific skills, primarily targeting 12 industries facing labor shortages like aged care. And in this March, the government decided to increase the number of those workers and expand the industries. And additionally, Japan is reforming its technical intern training program to better accommodate foreign workers. And as noted by Shirakawa-san, Japan can learn valuable lessons from Australia's experiences. To enhance productivity while integrating foreign labor, it's crucial to allocate them to suitable jobs based on data analysis. And while targeting specialized foreign labor is important, given the challenges of acquiring skilled workers in the competitive global labor market, the government must also establish a comprehensive strategy about this. Furthermore, in Japan case, I think to enhance productivity growth, private companies must provide attractive working environments for both foreign workers and Japanese. And local governments should intensify efforts to support foreign workers by enhancing educational environments for them and their families. We have to learn a lot about your experience. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Very great comments. And before asking you to reply, maybe Kyoji, do you have anything to add? Or
So can I make first 2 comments on Shirakawa-san's presentation? Is it okay? Or Australia, probably.
On the Japan session, maybe.
Okay, later. Okay. Brennan actually mentioned the deity, I think, and so deity is a little bit, we can say counterpart of Australian Productivity Commission, and we are in-house think tank of METI, but we have never got any pressure from government about our very pessimistic result on Japan's low performance of productivity. And I'm very impressed on Brennan's result on especially labor, resource allocation from the viewpoint of labor. We did a similar analysis using microdata, but we mainly focused on
expansion or shrink of production. Yeah, value added or, but it's very interesting. From the viewpoint of labor, you can talk about, for example, migration, how migrant workers or how elder workers move to higher productive farms. And I learned a lot. And I would like to do similar thing in future. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Governor Shirakawa, do you have anything to comment or?
I'm impressed by presentation, and especially I'm interested in terms of trade. And when I talked about Japan's problem, I didn't mention about terms of trade, not because I think this is not important, but in the interest of time I skip. And again, I'm trying to connect the discussion of terms of trade and demographic. For instance, Japan domestic market is now shrinking. Therefore, Japanese farmers are doing a lot of foreign outright direct investment. And my impression is this is one of the cause of the worsening terms of trade. But anyway, I'm interested to know what is the relationship between productivity and the terms of trade and the demographic. And I'm wondering whether there's any link between the two.
Okay, thank you very much. So then maybe I would like to first Ross to reply and the mic. But okay, so I would like to listen to you guys forever, but unfortunately I'm a moderator, so I need to think about the time constraints. So please try to be concise. I'm sorry to say that. Bye.
Well, first that last point, very interesting point from Shirakawa-san, relationship in terms of trade and foreign investment and Japan's relationship with the rest of the world. Well, we do know that when the world as a whole is growing very strongly, the terms of trade turns against Japan and in favor of Australia. And we saw a spectacular example of that in the first decade of this century, where you had a decade of very rapid growth in China, and that made all resources relatively scarce, and there was a 400% increase in the price, in real terms, price of iron ore, of oil, of coal, of aluminium, quite a dramatic increase. Now, I think there's a very interesting point in that. I did not mention it again in the, Shirakawa-san didn't mention it because of time, but there's a certain inevitability that the old reliance on coal and gas would have been less and less comfortable for Japan over time as growth proceeds in the rest of the world, and as the richest and cheapest resources of those things get depleted and we gradually move into the faster the growth in the rest of the world, the faster we have to move into low-grade deposits, prices rise. So even if there was no need to change away from coal and gas and oil because of climate change, we could expect that successful development in the rest of the world would raise these prices and really give us some requirement of movement away from those products anyway. And the relationship between Japanese direct foreign investment and growth in the rest of the world is that Japanese opening of the trade to imports from developing countries and direct foreign investment in, first of all, Korea and Taiwan, later in Southeast Asia, China, was actually quite important for their development. But I'm glad you did it, even if it turned the terms of trade a bit against Japan. And on Yuri's points about whether growth in Japan will be sustainable as we go through this decarbonisation challenge, I think that if we really focus on smooth decarbonisation, the answer is there's no reason why it should upset Japanese productivity growth, growth in living standards at all. But if we don't go through it smoothly, if we make a mess of it, if we change policies, don't have policies that facilitate the transition, don't have close and productive relations between Japan and Australia, then it could become very expensive. The sources of dynamism in the traded goods sector in Japan, and not all of those industries that import a lot of raw materials from Australia and elsewhere, the sources of dynamism are the advanced manufacturing, the use of the new information technology. There are many subsectors in there in which Japan leads the world and can continue to do so. And I think the Japanese experience shows that at times when you need this most, Japan can do it most successfully. But all of these industries, or many of them, require some inputs of materials. It's not a dominant source of comparative advantage, but you need some steel for advanced machines and so on. So the most important thing is that Japan has as low-cost access to these materials as possible, and by relying on foreign trade, getting them from the world's lowest-cost sources, and in the case of zero-carbon metals instead of minerals, that will often be Australia, then you can remove an impediment to competitiveness. It will never be that these industries for a long time have not been the main source of growth in Japan, but they can become an impediment to other industries growing rapidly if you don't have competitive supplies. And so getting the trade and development dimension of decarbonisation right is going to be important as an underpinning. The most important thing is not to try to do everything in Japan, raise the cost of the basic materials, which would make uncompetitive your advanced computing, your IT, your electric cars. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Michael, so you have a lot of comments. So, could you try to address as much as possible? Also, concisely, sorry.
Look, this is me thinking aloud, but I guess one link between the terms of trade and the foreign investment flows is that as Japan, with a smaller domestic economy or a smaller domestic population, as Japanese outbound investors are thinking more and more about trying to access growth markets, there is some merit, I guess, in thinking about markets that provide a natural hedge against the potential adverse terms of trade movements that Ross referred to. So when I think about the development of our resource sector, initially in partnership with Japan and then more recently with China, there was a tendency often for the foreign investor to take a stake in a mine that was largely about developing the resource, and there would be an offtake agreement often as part of it. It wasn't necessarily with the deliberate idea of having a natural hedge against the change in price, but it does serve that purpose. And you don't actually have to own resources in order to have that. You can gain exposure to the Australian economy via a range of means. And it might be that becomes attractive in a world where, to Ross's point, if the terms of trade are moving adversely to Japan, they may well be moving positively for Australia and vice versa.
Okay, thank you very much. So now I would like to have a presentation by Shiro. So I'm always asking Shiro a difficult task, something not just about Japan and Australia. So thank you so much for taking this kind of the presentation. So floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Ben. I think this is the transition from Australia to Japan, but I do want to step back and relates to a few points that Ross made. But a big challenge, I think, that we both share, Australia and Japan both share, and that's the hostile external environment. And I want to say a few things and then emphasize again why cooperation between Australia and Japan is going to be important in this world. So we're in a world of great power strategic competition between China and the United States, and it's zero-sum competition. So it's not zero emissions, but there's another big challenge. Zero-sum strategic competition is where one side, the United States or China, sees the gain in the other as a loss to themselves. It's a relative. They're obsessed with or fixated on relative gains, not absolute gains. It's a competition for primacy. And this is very different from what I think many of us on the panel are familiar with of economic competition, where you're trying to better yourself and become more productive, invest in infrastructure, education, research, and you have positive spillovers on the rest of the world and on other countries. Strategic competition, as the United States and China are engaged in, includes the objective of trying to keep the other away from the technological frontier. That's, of course, not good for technological advancement in the United States or China, but it has big spillovers for the rest of the world, of course. It's led to the weaponization of economics, coercion, economic coercion, and pressuring other countries to choose sides, of course. And it includes technology decoupling between the United States and China. And that includes sort of de-risking through sanctions, export controls, and restrictions on foreign investment. So the United States and China keeping each other away from the technological frontier makes everybody worse off, but also means a breakdown in cooperation in these global forums between the two major economies is fragmenting the rules. So we're having trouble creating multilateral rules or even understandings on new technologies, the digital economy, artificial intelligence, and this is going to hamper the productivity potential of these technologies. So what does this mean very quickly for Australia and Japan? Well, we're in a world, of course, where innovation today is dispersed more globally than it has been in the past, not just the United States or not just the G7, of course. And innovation in the modern economy means working with the best from wherever they are in the world and giving and taking ideas. So, the reality is that China's a major source of innovation, especially in renewables and energy sectors. And of course, concern about foreign influence over technology has led our countries, many Western countries, to cut themselves off from new Chinese technologies. And disengagement from China, not only where China's already ahead of the world in energy transition, for example, that's going to shrink back the technological frontier. So staying close to this frontier, including the energy technology frontier, will lower the costs of the energy transition that we've spoken about and increase the productivity benefit. I think there's a big opportunity, of course, for Japan to be leading on green technologies, but that's going to be much harder if it's cut off from Chinese research and economic engagement. Australia has had anti-dumping duties on Chinese wind turbines. Doesn't make too much sense, if you ask me. Becoming a technological backwater won't just make our countries poorer, it's going to make our countries weaker and less secure, of course. So that leads to a pretty big agenda, I think, for Australia and Japan. Bilaterally, as Ross spoke about, thinking through the energy transition bilaterally. Ross mentioned Australia supplies 1/3 of Japan's energy needs. That's 8 hours of electricity a day. And that is in coal, LNG, and uranium. And that is, of course, going to change very rapidly in the medium term. And both countries have, of course, committed to that already. And we need confidence in that transition. We need scenarios, and we need to understand each other better. So Australians need to understand what's happening up here in Japan, and vice versa. There's got to be much more institutionalized cooperation. But then coming back to the strategic competition, Australia and Japan have a role regionally in response to great power competition. This strategic competition is narrowing policy choices for Australia and Japan. It's making it harder to stay closer to the technological frontier. And we think we're a price taker in the international system, especially Australia is a small open economy, probably less so in Japan. But I think it's a fallacy of composition, and we have the ability to lead coalitions of essentially the rest of the world in changing this great power strategic competition into something more productive and positive sum. So hopefully that adds a new dimension to thinking about where the technological frontier is going to be. Thanks, Ippei.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shiro, for talking about the very big picture thing and productivity policy or environmental policy are not the closed economy issue. So it's a global issue. So we need to think that kind of thing globally. And thank you so much for the very nice, bridging presentation between Australia and Japan in an international economy. So now maybe we're going to discuss, maybe the productivity policy and the environmental policy in an open economy issue later. But let's move on to the Japan session. So I'd like to ask Kyoji to present on the current situation on the productivity on Japan. Yeah.
first, let me make comments on Professor Shirakawa's presentation. Just one point, because if you look at page 2 of Shirakawa-san's presentation, Japan's GDP per working age population growth is highest among these countries. And Paul Krugman also used this table. But because in Japan, the working hour per working age population increased a lot in the last 20 years, because more, as Shirakawa sensei pointed out, more female workers started to work, and also elder workers like me still, works. So if we, measure, productivity by working hour base, then Japan's performance is much less. That is, So that's why I would like to talk about Japan's low performance of labor productivity. So this figure shows sources of Japan's economic growth, and the vertical axis shows cumulative values in natural logarithm. And you can see until the early 2000, the Japan, and blue line shows GDP growth, real GDP growth, and the dotted line shows labor productivity growth. And in the case of Japan, working hour declined sharply, so the GDP growth was much lower than labor productivity growth. And you can see labor productivity growth slowed down after probably world financial crisis. And before that, Japan accomplished some, not very rapid, but accomplished some labor productivity growth, mainly by capital accumulation, the blue part. But after the world financial crisis, the blue part almost stopped to increase. And on the other hand, the red part, TFP, was relatively okay. TFP improved substantially. And the other, point is labor quality growth, the yellow part, stopped to grow. And so Japan's stagnation after the world financial crisis comes from two factors: the slowdown of capital accumulation and the slowdown of labor quality improvement. And today I would like to mainly talk about this. And if you look at next slide, this compares across major US and major European countries and Japan's source of economic growth. And we can see again, the red part, contribution of capital services in Japan is very small. And TFP growth was not so bad during this period, from 2005 to 2015. And contribution of labor quality here is positive, but as I will explain later, after 2015, it became negative. So the capital accumulation, slowdown of capital accumulation and the slowdown of labor quality improvement are the two main diseases of Japan's low labor productivity growth. And next slide, please. This figure shows, this is based on Cabinet Office data of real capital stock over real GDP. And we can see Japan is experiencing very strange phenomena. So the real capital stock GDP ratio declined over time. There are some jumps because of GDP dropped after financial crisis, and also GDP dropped during COVID-19. But except that period, real capital stock GDP ratio was in declining trend. No economic growth theorist thought about this. It could imagine about this type of phenomena. And the next slide, I discussed about why Japan experiencing decline of capital GDP ratio, but because time is limited, I will skip this. And because I don't have exact answer. So, but you can read this slide. And next slide shows the contribution of labor quality improvements. And you can see from after 2015, it became negative. And labor quality is basically, we economists measure labor quality by wage difference across characteristics of workers. If the job with higher wage is created, then labor quality is, we regard labor quality is improved, because labor's contribution to production can be measured by wage rate. So higher wage job increase, that means labor, the society utilize more efficiently the workers. And we regard it as the improvement of labor quality. And why labor quality declined? The bottom part of this, the second table in this slide shows we can decompose the labor quality change by labor characteristics. And we can see that the main driver of labor quality decline is caused by type of employment. That is, part-time, more and more part-time workers. New jobs are mainly part-time workers. And also sex. Female workers have lower wage, and more female workers start to work. So in next slide, we can, now Japan have more than 1/3 of workers are part-time workers. And the majority of female workers are part-time workers. And because part-time workers increased, it reduced labor quality. And the next slide shows wage gap between part-time and full-time. You can see the wage gap increase as you become aged. Because in the case of full-time workers, regular workers, you can accumulate skills, so your wage will increase. But if you are part-time workers, then your wage will not increase. So that means human capital accumulation was, we have a serious problem of human capital accumulation in Japan. Yeah, that's all. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I feel like I'm having a lecture on the Japanese economic growth and the productivity. I learned a lot. Thank you so much. Then I would like to ask Yuri to present your ideas.
Today, as a member of the government's New Capitalism Council, I would like to share with you the discussions we have been holding in the council and talk about how productivity improvement is positioned within Japan's growth strategy. Japan's growth strategy places a special emphasis on investing in people, and that is human capital. So I will provide insights into the background behind the growth strategy and then describe the remaining challenges. Next page, please. Let me start with talking a little bit about the relationship between growth strategy and new capitalism. From a global perspective, in the 2010s, not only global investors such as BlackRock, but also the Business Roundtable, the global consisted of CEOs of large global companies in the US, criticized myopic stockholders' capitalism and made proposals that corporate executives should seek to increase corporate value by solving social issues such as environmental problems and economic disparities. This message means a shift in focus toward multi-stakeholders approach that includes employees and workers, future generations, and regional communities. Investment in human capital is very important in Japan, as a fundamental challenge for the Japanese economy is sustained real wage growth supported by productivity growth. Japan's growth strategy positions that quality of human resources are the key to achieving groundbreaking innovations and productivity growth, and their development must be supported through reskilling education and through a smooth shift of the labor force into companies or sectors with higher productivity. I will show several charts. Next page, please. This chart is from the Cabinet Office data. shows the trends of the potential growth rate and total factor productivity in Japan since the early 1990s. Maybe Fukao-san mentions about how the TFP is, the quality of labor is included or not to the TFP afterwards. The potential growth rate shown in the black line is estimated to have remained flat, while TFP, the white bar, has been around 0.5%. Next page, please. Real wage growth has been largely stagnant in Japan for the last 30 years. In 2023, however, the wage increase rate as a result of spring wage negotiations was in the 3% range, and this year it has gone up further to the 5% range for large companies, reflecting inflation and labor shortages. I think it is crucial for the Japanese economy to continue real wage increases through productivity growth. Next page, please. Let me show you one of the reasons for the sluggish productivity growth. Japanese investment in intangible assets such as software and data, human resources, intellectual property is relatively low when compared internationally, with insufficient investment in human resources being particularly serious. Next page, please. There are policies issues and goals included in the framework for the realization of a new form of capitalism in 2022 and 23 by the Cabinet. One of the major issues are investing in people and realization of wage increases. We have discussed the 3 pillars of labor market reform. There are to improve individuals' ability to acquire new skills and knowledge by providing reskilling opportunities, to promote a shift to job-based employment, which would offer competitive rewards based on the skills of the employees, and to facilitate labor mobility into companies or sectors with higher productivity. We also discussed investment in startups to promote innovation and dynamism of the economy, targeted investment in science, technology, and innovation, investment in digital transformation and green transformation. Various policy tools related to labor market reform and budgetary measures to expand investments in people have already been decided or executed. These measures are expected to gradually affect productivity growth. But there is still much to be considered to achieve sustained productivity growth. In particular, I also think the correction of the gender gap and the gap between regular and non-regular workers is very important. Next page, please. Non-regular employees, as well as female workers, are considered to have great potential to utilize their abilities in Japan, as Fukao sensei mentioned. The number of non-regular workers has been increasing since the 2000s, but investment towards them is much less than regular workers. In Japan, as Shirakawa-san shows the M-shaped curve, the early women employment rate by age group with the early 20s and late 40s forming 2 peaks that resembled the letter M. In the last 10 years, the M-shaped curve has become flat. The problem lies in the share of regular workers among women. The regular worker ratio declines for women aged 30 and older. It is often called an L-shaped curve, as it resembles the letter L. This indicates that regular women employees need to ensure flexibility in their work styles when they have children. And the right graph shows men's annual income by type of employment in 2020. 3 million yen was generally said to be the upper limit for non-regular workers. And it has been very difficult for non-regular workers to become regular workers. In this respect, I think that government should give more support to these workers who wish to promote it to or change jobs by providing a social safety net that will let them find their next job smoothly. As Shirakawa-san said, these policies are also important for preventing declining birth rate. Recently, with the advent of generative AI, there seems to be an earnest need for more reskilling opportunities for white-collar workers as well. Japan's employment system has traditionally been based on lifetime employment and seniority-based remuneration. However, now this does not allow for flexible response to changes in industrial structure and technology. For productivity growth, it is necessary to create a multi-track and flexible employment system so that people from diverse backgrounds can all play active roles. The next page, please. As Shirakawa-san emphasized, for confronting demographic changes, our goal is to achieve a population stability and bolster economic resilience. Dealing with the population challenge means mainly focusing on preventing the acceleration of declining birth rate and welcoming foreign workers. As for productivity growth, due to growing pressures including labor shortage in Japan, DX and GX, demands for investment have been already starting to increase. I think that Japanese companies must improve their productivity not only by raising awareness of cost efficiency, but also by shifting their business models so that they can provide higher value-added service and goods at appropriate prices and raise markup ratios. I hope the government should take the lead not only accelerate for reform of the labor market, but also create a more dynamic economy through fostering various business models or startups and business restructuring, or by reforming regulations in numerous areas to promote competition. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yuri, for a very comprehensive yet insightful presentation. And I think we had 4 presentations on Japanese growth and productivity issues. Eventually, the economic growth is pinned down by 3 factors, technological growth, and the growth in the labor input, and the growth in capital. Okay. Then first, regarding the labor, Governor Shirakawa's keynote speech, aging definitely a key issues. And also the Yuri's presentation, so that maybe that we can improve the labor input through the female labor participation. And also this is related to the technological progress, maybe more like also, as Michael emphasized, efficient use of the human resources. And regarding the capital formation, physical investment in intangibles, Kyoji mentioned, so that it's still not clear, but it's big issues. And regarding the final point and the main point of this conference and the technological progress, so Shiro mentioned maybe the more efficient sorting of the tasks among the countries, or outsourcing, or that kind of thing may improve the TFP. And also the Kyoji and Yuri mentioned, so maybe a more human capital investment may improve the technology. So that's kind of my understanding what you present in at today's the symposium. So first, Governor Shirakawa, so now do you have anything to add after listening to the Kyoji and the Yuri and the Shiro's presentation?
Okay, first I'd like to make a comment on Professor Fukao-san. I perfectly agree with what he said. And whenever I talk about Japanese economy, I wonder which concept best captures the problem: GDP or GDP per working age population, GDP per person, or GDP per working hours. And it depends on the context. And if we look back the past 30 years, in retrospect, we Japanese preferred to work less. Of course, there's a lot of problem with non-regular workers. I fully agree with them. But we had made deliberate effort at reducing work hours. So if so, in terms of measuring productivity, probably GDP per working hours is the best. But if we think about the welfare of individual, probably GDP per person or GDP per working age population is better. So it depends. So I agree with you. And second is the reason why we are deficient in capital accumulation. And as the Professor Fukao-san said, there is no answer. But my lingering hypothesis is it is linked with the declining population. And if the domestic market is shrinking, and if farmers are faced with a choice of investing either domestically or abroad, then naturally Japanese farmers prefer to invest more in foreign countries, including the physical capital and human capital. So that is my part of the answer.
Okay, thank you very much. So these are also great comments. So before having a reply, so Shiro, maybe do you have something to say?
Yeah, thanks, Ippei. Those are really interesting presentations and reminds me of in Australia in the Treasury they use for the intergenerational report the 3 Ps: population growth, participation, and productivity growth, to look at aggregate GDP over time. And of course, productivity growth being the most important. But as we've heard from Shirakawa-san and the other discussion, they're not independent: population, participation, productivity growth. And first on population, just a couple of comments or questions. Okina-san joined us in Canberra in 2019. We had a few sessions talking about different approaches to immigration and what Japan could learn from Australia. It came out of those discussions that both our immigration policies are somewhat converging. So, more temporary workers in Australia and fewer, still many pathways to permanent migration, but fewer pathways. And support for new arrivals in Australia has fallen over time, especially for those who are not permanent residents and arriving for permanent migration. Whereas in Japan, it's very generous, yet there are fewer pathways to permanent migration in Japan. So a question about, is that on the agenda? I'm looking forward to Fukao-san's research on the misallocation of migrants in Japan, but there's an issue of being able to attract high-skilled migrants if it's only for temporary, 5-year visas, for example, with uncertainty about being able to stay on. So a question about whether there is that thinking and discussion in Japan. And then the second issue on participation, and we heard a lot about this, including high casualization of the workforce. And I want to test with Okina-san, we've got a relatively low birth rate in Japan, although it's picked up a bit, and low participation from women. And so it looks like still a lot of women have to choose between a career or having children. I think the literature internationally is that is not the case in many countries. They're not seen as substitutes. And what it comes down to is we need big societal change in Japan so that it's not the traditional role of women raising children, mothers raising children almost alone, but office work hours that go too long mean that only one parent can work and pick up children. But also that raises the issue of men doing more household work and joining in household production. So more equality in the household, more equality in work and in society. And I thought that's what the message was from the literature out of the, looking at the United States or even Australia and the progress Australia's made and Scandinavia. And I think, is that still the case in Japan? Am I being a little bit too black and white was my question. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for the great comments. So you are raising a very important issue, bridging the Australian issue and the Japan issue. So Kyoji, do you want to reply now, or maybe the questions about the physical capital, also like a migration things about migration thing from Shiro, and Shiro pointed out the gender things. Then I would like to come back that kind of topic later. So at the moment, Kyoji, if you have anything to reply, please go ahead.
So in the case of migration, we don't have very good data on migrant in Japan, but according to population census, I think that education level of migrants, average education level of migrants are higher than Japanese average, non-migrants. So at this moment, we have more, skilled workers, migrants, I think. But I don't know in future. And according to OECD, the OECD have indices of attractiveness of skilled migrants. And Japan's rank is, if we take account of, I think, social security, system. Our system is relatively good, especially in the case of health care. So if we take account of that, Japan is at the middle level. But wage rate for skilled workers is, as you know, not so high. So I'm not sure in the future we can keep the inflow of, skilled workers in Japan. And can I make one comment to Okina-san's?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, as Okina-san already partly pointed out, if you look at the second page of her handout, its cabinet office is a gross accounting result. And so basically, from GDP growth, when you subtract capital input contribution and labor input contribution, you have, as a residual, you have TFP. And according to this cabinet office result, the TFP is in declining trend. But as I told you, according to our JIP database of Rieti, the TFP growth is accelerating after around mid-2000. And why the difference? It is because labor quality is not taken account in cabinet office data. So because Okina-san, and also it is very important from the viewpoint of, as Shiro-san pointed out, in our future, according to the government, we expect annual inflow of migrants 0.2% of total population. So in 40 years, we have 8% of, say, migrants in Japan. So it will have a huge impact on labor quality also. So I think it is important for Japanese cabinet office to take account of labor quality issue. And otherwise, we miss the important mechanism of labor productivity growth. And since Okina-san is an influential person at the cabinet office and the prime minister's office, I wish she can, raise this issue at some, committee. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Very insightful comments. And this is the migration issues. Then I would like to ask Okina-san to talk about the, female labor participation, and also that's maybe the Australia is way advanced in Japan. So I would like to have some comments from Ross and Michael after maybe the Okina-san's discussion. So Okina-san, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Shiro-san. To bridge the gender gap to boost productivity, we must first prioritize implementing flexible work arrangement, as I mentioned. And another obstacle is, just you said, the altering deeply ingrained perception of gender roles still now. And a survey data indicates that majority of Japanese individuals still uphold the notion that child rearing should primarily be the responsibility of wives. And conversely, in countries like Sweden, shared child care responsibilities between couples are widely accepted. Recently, but it appears that such attitudes have gradually begun to shift in Japan. And last year, for example, listed companies in Japan were mandated to disclose the rate of paternal leave by the government. And in line with Shirakawa-san's emphasis, promoting paternal leave for child care is a significant step towards dismantling gender stereotypes. And in comparison to OECD countries, women in Japan experience significantly lower lifetime wages for their education, often due to engagement in part-time or irregular jobs, as previously mentioned. There is ongoing discourse in Japan regarding the social insurance system. which tends to favor housewives. And I believe it warrants re-evaluation. Recognize the untapped potential of women in Japan can lead to activation of their abilities. Moreover, I believe such policies are crucial for addressing Japan's declining birth rate too.
Okay, thank you very much. So now, as I said, so Australia is way advanced in migration things and the female labor participation. So that I would like to have some views from Australian experts. So this time, Michael, could you start your discussion? Also, you can ask any question to the previous presentation.
Well, a couple of observations on the gender issues, which I think are things that have evolved very gradually in Australia, and I think there's been substantial progress, but not there yet. I was just trying to look up the part-time employment rate by country across the OECD, but I have a recollection that Australia's is relatively high, along with the Netherlands, and that is, I'm not sure why that is. That might be partly a cultural thing. I don't know whether there are particular labour force institutions, labour market institutions that make that more likely, but it does provide it has provided a degree of flexibility now. It is more utilised by women than men, and you know, I'd have to look at the record on whether that's equalising. The gender pay gap in Australia remains, although it has narrowed. It's interestingly, it is a much higher profile issue today than it was even 5 years ago. Most recent, we have an agency that has that collects statistics. It's the Workforce Gender Equity Agency, collects statistics and now has a process of, for want of a better term, naming and shaming companies because they calculate a gender pay gap by company or for large companies, and it creates a lot of awkwardness for individual companies. Now, of course, what companies then do is come up with a number of plausible justifications as to why they have a gender pay gap. And typically what they look to is occupational sorting. So they'll make the observation that, I might be a major international airline, for example. I'll make the observation that, well, the pilots are men and the flight attendants are women and the pilots are high paid. So it's really not our fault. It's a societal issue. It's about occupational choice. I mean, we've done a bit of work looking into that, and it's actually, I mean, there is a lot of occupational sorting in Australia, as there would be in Japan, but as a source of the gender pay gap, it's actually only about 20% of the story, and the rest of it is basically the gender pay gap that exists within individual occupations. So it is a mysterious phenomenon to try and grapple with and identify a source for. Progress, but a fair way to go.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ross.
A couple of points on Yuri's presentation, partly related to Michael's. In Australia, we do have very high part-time employment, and especially for women. We've got quite strong incentives in our tax and social security system, a very tightly means-tested social security system, which allows people to get a certain number of hours of work, after which they start to lose very quickly their social security, so that the marginal effective tax rate is very high if you go from, say, 15 hours of work to 25 or 30 hours of work. And Yuri mentioned that in Japan there's quite a lot of social security support for women to be housewives. So maybe some of the explanation of what we're seeing is actually there in the incentive structure in the tax and social security system. So it's something that could be researched and worth looking at. Another question to Yuri. In your comments on my presentation, you mentioned that Japan has got a big place in global innovation and has used that for economic success in the past. This is a time of extraordinary innovation in information technology, artificial intelligence. I would have thought that Japan was the place in the world where you'd see most of this more quickly. why, when we talk about productivity, why is no one saying that this is going to be a source of productivity in Japan? Has Japan changed, or can't we measure it, or are we neglecting something that actually will be very important?
Okay, thank you very much. So, do you want to reprise something, or maybe now let the participants to ask the questions? Or do you want to reprise something now? Or okay, Okina-san, please.
Thank you very much for your comment. I think that restoring economic dynamism through fostering competition and also fostering the startups is very, very important. It's of course, there is a discussion in the new capital realization committee, discussion about how to foster the startup and how to foster the innovation in Japan. So it is important to input the money and human capital to startups, but also it is very, very important to struggle with the many regulations in Japan to break through the new technology and also such as digital transformation in various areas. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So even there's a good idea, there are lots of regulations and that there are lots of obstacles to solve. Okay, so now I would like to have questions from the floors. What is important for the technology is exchanging the ideas. So the discussion is super important. So I eagerly anticipate active discussions between floor participants and the panelists. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and a microphone will be there. Start your question. Okay, yeah.
Thank you all for fantastic presentations. I learned a terrific amount. My question, I think, is mainly for Okina-san. And it's based on casual observation as an employee of a Japanese institution. The point is very well made that Japan has suffered from having half of its workforce underemployed or not in the labor force at all, that's women. It's obviously changed a tremendous amount in the past. And I want you to speculate about what is perhaps a silver lining from the COVID pandemic, which is that work practices have now begun to change really dramatically. I see it in my own workplace. We have a lot of flexibility about when we come to work and when we stay home. And I wonder whether you could speculate as to whether that will perhaps improve the prospects for women to be more productive members of the labor force.
Thank you very much for your question. I think that COVID-19 pandemic is very impacted to Japanese working style, I think so. And not only the Japan Research Institute, but also the many companies start the hybrid working style. And there is a survey data that in the cabinet office that the more people stay at home at that time, and many couples think that we have to share the child care or home tasks each other. So I think that kind of the sentiment of the task sharing within the couples are dramatically changing at that time. So I hope that the trend is going to continue, and the many women who have children can easily continue their works at the very flexible working style. Thank you.
Peter, could you start your...
I want to come back to the relationship between Australia and Japan, the connection between what we've got to do in the relationship now and productivity, productivity prospects in both countries. And it really comes back, I should say, like Ian, this has been an incredibly stimulating conversation. There's so many questions and issues that have been raised through the conversation that I hope that we double down on together and work on closely together down the track. Now my question. a number of people, Ross, Shiro, Yuri-san, mentioned the need for a new framework of cooperation between Australia and Japan to manage the huge change that will have to take place in the economic relationship between our two countries. We have a wonderfully large and important relationship, but it's a carbon trade relationship. Fundamentally, it's a huge carbon trade relationship. And if we are to achieve the social and economic objectives, social objectives that we've set ourselves to achieve over the next 30 years or so, 20, 30 years or so, then we've got to transform that relationship completely. It'll be fundamentally changed over that night, or else we fail our social and political objectives. So my question is a very simple one. You've talked about the need for a new framework for cooperation. My question is, what exactly will that do, and what should it look like? What would it look like if it's going to be effective? And how would it address the issues that we worry about now?
Okay, Ross needs to leave at 5:30 to take a break at the flight, so that you go ahead.
Yeah, I think that first of all, we both have to accept ourselves and understand ourselves that we have to make these big changes, because not all of our societies on both sides have properly understood that. And once you do that, then we can start thinking systematically about what needs to be done. And when you think about what needs to be done, it leads very quickly to think there has to be a very big role for Australia-Japan cooperation, rather central to it. Even more so than with the change in Japan's energy trade when oil from the Middle East became more problematic. And then what should we do once we realize, how should we do it once we realize what needs to be done? Most of the world is having a big struggle getting its head around how to apply economics to policy making in this area. And so I think that the types of people we have in this room can contribute to that, and just applying good economics can get us quite a long way. We've got to correct two very big externalities: the external costs of carbon and the external benefits that come from innovation, from creation of new ways of doing things. And we shouldn't be making these decisions on the best way to implement policy completely in isolation, because our decisions affect each other. And so there's got to be a lot of communication, of joint study, development of programs that are compatible, where policy is compatible with each other. We can get a long way ourselves, and we can provide something of a model. But as Shiro said, we have to think about this in a global context. First, because it's a global problem. Secondly, because a lot of our own trade issues are going to require multilateral dimensions for success. And I think the way that we did do things at that last time of fundamental change in the 70s has got a lot to offer, but I've already said something about that. So, Ippei, I'll stop there.
Okay. It's not just Australia-Japan cooperation, because here we are with the ANU and Japan Research Institute, but I think everything that's been talked about of this energy relationship, Australia has an outsized importance in Japan because of that, and that's why we've mattered in the past, and that's why we'll probably matter, hopefully, in the future, but in a completely different way. And it can't be confined to just government-to-government cooperation or business-to-business, but it does obviously need to include more whole of society and researchers focused on these issues. And whenever Ross or Peter start to talk in these terms, I take them as instructions, and I'm getting pretty daunted because there's a pretty big research agenda and a lot of work to do that I'm hoping we can carry on with the Japan Research Institute too.
I enjoy the panel discussion very much, but like Peter Drasdale said, it seems that there are more questions to be answered than questions to answer. And let me just cite a few questions. I thought that Shiro's presentation resonated with me very well in terms of kind of political economy or global, the strategic competition that you mentioned. And it seems to me, in terms of economics, we all know that the economics works in its own right under a certain framework, for sure. But the only thing is that there is an economic or market factor here we have to deal with, we are confronted with. And these are including, of course, the climate change or a pandemic or even wars, those things. Or sometimes, like Shirakawa-san said, societal choices. These are all relating to what the malaise that we are, or challenges that we are faced with. For example, in terms of Australia, you are confronted with a kind of transformation challenge from this fossil driven economy to a renewable energy economy, and it is moving very well. It's not on track, frankly speaking. So, but in terms of the Labour government, I think what is that? Is a future made in Australia policy. I think that this is this is all about non-economic or government intervention in the vision. So that has to be somehow compromised between non-economic factor and between economic factor. And in terms of Japanese, obviously, we all know that the non-economic factor here has been playing some part, like zero interest rate policy or negative interest policy. This is obviously against the economic understanding, but we have to live with it. And also in terms of immigrants taking, Japanese economy have been kind of free from, very reluctant to take in the foreign workers. But obviously foreign workers inflow, it has been the economic driving force for Australian economy. So these, the non-economic factors or government intervention or societal, the choices, they have to be, confronted outright. And then, each economy had its own societal, inhibitions, and these things have to be addressed in the kind of global sense and the framework. This obviously relates to IRA of the U.S. government, U.S.-China rivalry. These are I think, the grand, problems that we have to address first. And I would like to invite any answers or comment from the panelists. Thank you.
So this is another job for you, Shiro, potentially. But Professor Drysdale made comment, I think, about the need for us to have greater collaboration and to use this time whereby both countries can look at the transformation and transition that's required. And I would encourage our Australian colleagues to learn more, and Shiro knows this is a pet subject of mine. I would encourage Australian colleagues to learn more about the challenges that are faced by modern Japanese society. And to learn more about what is written potentially in Japanese and not so much in English. As we know, a lot of good work is undertaken in Japanese, and there are many reports that the Japanese government and businesses are issuing. So we need more exchange, we need more thought around how we actually study what's happening in Japan and why it's happening. And so I would love to know what the AJRC might do to support some of that. The other thing I just wanted to make mention of is that Australia might appear to be quite advanced in many ways regarding gender pay gap and gender in general. But I would note that of the Australian Stock Exchange top 100 companies, there are only 6 Australian women chairmen. So that is quite a sobering fact in itself. In any case, on that dreary note, I will hand back to the panel and ask about any specific or practical ways that you think we might be able to lead the next generation in understanding more about the Australia-Japan relationship. Thank you.
I have a question about the lack of capital accumulation, and this question go to Shirakawa Sensei and Fukao Sensei. Shirakawa Sensei mentioned that the prospect of population contraction is the reason for little investment. But the same thing is happening in Korea, for the best of my knowledge, Korean firms are aggressively investing in spite of the shrinking population. So the prospect of population decrease alone will probably not explain why there is lack of capital accumulation. And Fukao Sensei, you skipped the slide, but I'll give you the opportunity to discuss why do you think Japan is faced with this shortage of capital accumulation, and what can be done to deal with it? And the second question goes back to Shirakawa Sensei. We cannot address the population reduction right away, but what can we do to restore the investment for capital in Japan? What can we do? What policy measures can take place?
My question is related to the education. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the all interesting point. But at my age, when I feel that the education in my country is going on well, then I really feel that well, I can pass on the baton to the next generation. But if it doesn't, then I don't know what to do, what to say. Now, I see two diametrical opposition directions. There are now sort of effort in some part of the Japanese education, trying to bring up children and youngsters with such a new creative ideas. And that information, it's in a way, if you can find it, it's rampant. But if I have 4 grandchildren, incidentally, if I look at them, they don't have any benefit of getting these creative educational system. Now, from looking from the Australia, my question is, what do you see in our educational system? Do you think that Japan is doing enough to bring up the children and youngsters to have creating mind from high schools, and when you get to the university, you have already some entrepreneurship ideas? That is my question. Thank you very much.
My question is to Shiro Armstrong. You raised an important issue of international strategic competition. And this is a dialogue now between Japan and Australia. And between these two countries, whatever problems there arise, I have no doubt that there can be found some kind of solution, because we share the same values, and we talk frankly and openly each other like this forum. And when we think about the future of whatever digital transformation or green transformation, the role of China is very important in this region. And of course, Australia, as the number 1 trade partner, is by far biggest China, both importantly export. But the question is whether there can be such frank, open discussions among 3, or possibly also with the United States, among 4. So far as my contact with Chinese students or Chinese academics are concerned, there is a rich array of talented people, educated people in China. But the question is, even with these individually wonderful people, there can be such a frank, open discussion to solve common problems. If there is, how, please?
Okay, thank you very much. These are great questions, and we have questions about non-economic issues, and also the female labor participation issue again, and how Australian Japan Research Center should be. That's really specific to you, and maybe you're going to talk at the closing session, and why the capital formation is low, and maybe the need for the education for more like a creative talent, and sort of international the policy debate. So maybe Shiro, you need to answer so many things. I would like to go from this side. So Yuri, maybe okay. So time is limited, so each can reply within 1 minute. Okay, within 1 minute, and especially you could address maybe the female labor kind of thing. Yeah, anything you like.
I believe that we should, in Japan, we should increase the baseline academic knowledge through education that respects, maximizes the potential of individuality, and nurture problem setting and problem solving ability and creativity in a highly uncertain future, I think. And I think from the primary education stage, in a learning process, teachers should respect individuality and develop individual strengths, I think. So maybe I think the OS of the education is just a little bit have to be changed, I think. Is it okay?
Thank you very much. And Governor Shirakawa, and there's a question about nothing can be done for the population, or there are several questions. So could you address some of them?
When it comes to policy, we tend to discuss what should be done, but what is most important is how we should create a reasonable consensus among society. This is the hardest part of policy making. In that sense, the very basis for discussion on policy is information. And in that regard, the exchanges of views between countries is quite relevant. For instance, when I'm asked to make speech today in today's conference, I read several papers on Australian economy, and by reading those papers, I learned a lot. And the same is true. I hope the same is happening for many participants in this room. So when it comes to societal choice, or when it comes to policy choice, the best thing we have to do is the information and the information exchange, and that is that could be a source of solving the problem. And on capital shortage, I'm not saying that population is everything. Of course, this is one of the reasons. But when Japanese, in terms of Japanese firms, they are not so passive. And if we look at both domestic investment and outward direct investment, then Japanese firms are rather aggressive. So, but nonetheless, if they are faced with a choice of domestic investment or foreign investment, then they prefer to invest more in foreign countries. In that sense, population is playing some role. That is my point. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Kyoji, maybe especially everybody would like to know why the capital formation is low in Japan. So could you address this question?
I'm not sure, but my probably hypothesis is we have, in the last 10 years, as I have explained, we have a lot of cheap labor supply, new supply, or as a part-time workers. And that's why, as you know, Japan's wage rate is very low in comparison with other OECD countries. So companies, firms do not have incentive to replace labor with capital. I think that's the main factor.
So somehow because wage is low, so yeah.
It's low because labor union is not, their priority is employment, and also a lot of very rapid labor supply in the last 10 years. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So Michael, so there's of course you can address anything, but Melanie especially talked about still maybe the female labor participation is not so big in Australia, but anything if you can address, please go ahead.
Sure. I was going to choose two things off the buffet. One, on the question of non-economic factors, obviously that is true, and that's going to be a significant determinant of a lot of policy. There are going to be political constraints, primarily in decarbonisation. I actually think the economics of decarbonisation is not that complicated, but the technology of decarbonisation is tough, and the politics is very tough. I guess the observation that I would make is even when societal choices are being made, and I absolutely agree that those broader measures of well-being that incorporate life expectancy, that incorporate inequality and leisure, the lack of long working hours, are a richer indicator than GDP per capita. But where other societal choices are being made or political decisions are being made, I still think there is going to be an economic angle. Often there's a cost. There's a lot of merit in having institutions that can put some transparency around that cost, around the trade-off, to at least inform the public debate. And there's nothing wrong with informed societal choices, I guess. The other question was about education and whether the Japanese schooling system serves the economy well. And I know not much about this, but I guess the observation I would make is that on what I know of the Japanese schooling system, I know one thing, and that's based on the OECD PISA results, and it seems to be performing very well, and it seems to be performing a lot better than the Australian system. And so I acknowledge the concern about, is the system less good at cultivating a spirit of creativity and entrepreneurship, for example. But I think it is hard. I think from what I do know about educational practice, it's very hard to teach creativity in the abstract. Most of us are creative when we have domain-specific expertise. And so learning the domain-specific expertise is a very important ingredient, a very important building block to creativity. And I think it actually has a lot more to do ultimately with culture and with the sort of society and the sort of economy that our young people go out into ultimately. And I just put up, we worry a lot about schooling. In Australia, we worry a lot about it because our PISA results have declined a lot. There are some economies that do very well in PISA. One that doesn't do very well at all is the United States. And for all that, if I have to wager, in 30 years, I'll say the United States will still be the richest large economy in the world. Why? Not because their education system is terrific, not because they're churning out 17 and 18-year-olds who are, cognitively brilliant, but it's just a highly entrepreneurial, highly dynamic society and economy, one that favours risk-taking, one that rewards entrepreneurship. It's not perfect by any means for all the reasons that we've discussed, but I think that's ultimately where the creativity comes in, more so than perhaps in the classroom. But that's just a surmise.
Okay, thank you very much, Shiro. So you have lots of things to answer, but 1 minute. Go ahead.
So very, very quickly, and in fact, the point I was going to make, Michael just made on, these non-economic factors still need analysis and careful economic as well as other analysis. Just take a lot of these economic security measures or economic tools used in the name of security. They make us poorer. We also have to think about how much it makes us poorer and whether they make us more secure too. And it's not always clear to me. And I think clear analysis is what we need across a raft of these issues, and hence comes back to the work we need to do. And on Tetsuji's question on, can we have frank and open discussions with China in the room and with the United States? I think that's incumbent on us to create the atmosphere and the frameworks, and whether we need to do it in broader groups. And we can, of course, do that in academia, but hopefully that can be a starting point. But it's a relationship, the Australia-China relationship, Japan-China relationship. These are all relationships that have to be managed.
Okay, thank you very much. And so before having the closing remarks by Shiro, maybe Yuri, do you want to say something or?
Just 1 minute. Thank you very much for introducing the Australian Productivity Commission. Because I am very impressed about the existence of such kind of institution and function in Australia. And this esteemed reputation is founded about the Commission's commitment to highly specialized and objective analysis, and as well as extensive engagement with the public. So I feel once again that these are many lessons that Japan can learn from Australia. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. So now we would like to have a closing remarks by Shiro. So Shiro, please go ahead.
Thanks, Ippei. These will be very brief. My job is just really to thank everybody. That was a really rich and thought-provoking discussion, and there's a big research agenda for us at the AJRC, but jointly with JRI going forward. I want to thank Ippei for chairing the session and steering us through a discussion, sticking roughly to time. Please join me in thanking Ippei. And thank you very much to the panelists for that really rich discussion. And of course, thank you to the Japan Research Institute, Tanizaki-san and Okina-san for hosting us in this spectacular venue. We now have a quick break. We're back in this room for the reception, but they need to redo the room so we can enjoy the view out there, the beautiful view in the foyer, and then we'll be able to call everyone back in. And please do join us. There's a lot of sushi and delicious food and a lot of booze, a lot of sake. But it's going to be an important opportunity, I think, for all of us to catch up and continue some of these discussions informally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. But okay, so you want to go for the reception right now, but I would like to thank the Shinoda-san supporting this event fantastically. Thank you. Also for other staffs to help test from the Australian Japan Research Center. Yes. Yeah. And of course, last but not least, thank you so much for all of you for the active participation. And please join me thanking the panelists for fantastic discussion. Thank you very much.